The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning in June of 1882, and Florence Kane held it in trembling hands as she stood on the platform of the Montrose train station in western Colorado, watching the dust settle where her intended had just galloped away without so much as a backward glance. She had traveled all the way from Boston, 3 weeks on trains and stage coaches, her trunk filled with carefully pressed dresses and a wedding gown wrapped in tissue paper. The telegram from Robert Henderson had arrived 6 months prior, formal and proper, asking for her hand in marriage after corresponding for nearly a year. He had painted such beautiful pictures with his words of the life they would build together on his ranch outside Montrose, of the mountains that touched the sky and the clear rivers that ran through valleys so green they hurt your eyes to look at them. She had accepted, packed her life into that trunk, and kissed her elderly mother goodbye with promises to send for her once she was settled. But Robert Henderson had taken one look at her stepping off that train, turned his horse around, and ridden away so fast the animal's hooves kicked up clouds of red dirt that still hung in the air. Florence stood there in her traveling dress of deep blue wool, far too warm for the Colorado summer, her dark blonde hair pinned up beneath a hat that had seemed fashionable in Boston but looked absurdly formal here in this rough town. She was 22 years old, and she had never felt more alone in her entire life. The station master had already retreated inside his office, clearly uncomfortable with the scene he had just witnessed. A few townspeople lingered nearby, their curiosity barely concealed behind sidelong glances and whispered conversations. She felt the tears building behind her eyes but refused to let them fall. She would not give these strangers the satisfaction of seeing her break down, not here, not now. Instead, she picked up her carpetbag, straightened her shoulders, and began walking toward the main street of Montrose. Her trunk could wait. Right now, she needed to find somewhere to sit down and figure out what on earth she was going to do. The town was smaller than she had imagined, just a single main street with wooden buildings on either side, their false fronts making them appear grander than they actually were. A general store, a saloon, a hotel, a livery stable, and a few other establishments she did not have the presence of mind to identify. The mountains Robert had described were indeed there, rising up in the distance like massive walls of stone and pine, beautiful and indifferent to her predicament. She made it as far as the hotel porch before her legs gave out and she sank onto a bench near the door. She set her carpetbag down and stared at her hands, still clutching that telegram. Why had he run? What had he seen that so repelled him? She knew she was not a great beauty, but neither was she ugly. Her features were pleasant enough, her figure acceptable, her manners impeccable. What had she done wrong simply by existing? "Madam, are you all right?" The voice was deep and gentle, with a drawl that spoke of Texas rather than Colorado. Florence looked up to find a man standing a respectful distance away, his hat in his hands. He was tall and lean, with sun-darkened skin and dark brown hair that needed a trim. His eyes were a striking shade of gray-blue, and they held genuine concern. He wore dusty work clothes, chaps over denim trousers, a faded cotton shirt, and a bandana around his neck. A working cowboy, she assessed immediately. "I am fine, thank you," she said automatically, though her voice wavered. "Begging your pardon, madam, but you do not look fine." He shifted his weight, clearly uncertain whether to stay or go. "I was at the station just now. I saw what happened." That was about the rudest thing I ever witnessed a man do, and I have seen some low behavior in my time. Florence felt her composure crack. "I do not understand. We corresponded for a year. He asked me to marry him. I came all this way and he just looked at me and left. He did not even speak a single word. The cowboy's jaw tightened. Then he is a fool and a coward, and honestly, madam, I would say he just made room for someone better. Despite everything, Florence felt a small smile tug at her lips. That is kind of you to say, but it does not solve my immediate problem. I have no place to stay, limited funds, and no way to return to Boston. I spent nearly everything I had on the journey here. The man stepped closer, his expression thoughtful. Well, madam, I reckon we can solve at least part of that. My name is William Foster, and I work at the Double Creek Ranch about 5 miles north of town. The owner, Mrs. Patricia Summers, is a widow who runs the place with her 2 sons. She is always saying she needs help with the household, someone who can cook decent meals and maybe teach her boys some proper manners and book learning. They are good kids, but they are growing up rough. If you are willing to work, I expect she would be willing to offer you room and board, maybe a small wage besides. Florence studied him carefully. She had been warned about trusting strangers, especially men in the West, but there was something honest in William Foster's face. His eyes met hers directly, without guile or calculation, and more importantly, she did not have many options. That is a generous offer, Mr. Foster, but why would you help me? You do not know me at all. William turned his hat in his hands, a gesture she was coming to recognize as a sign of his discomfort. Well, madam, I suppose because it is the right thing to do, and because I know what it is like to be far from home with nowhere to turn. I came out here from Texas 5 years ago with nothing but my horse and my saddle. Mrs. Summers gave me a chance when no one else would. Figure I should pass that kindness along. I see. Florence made her decision. Then I accept your offer, Mr. Foster. I would be grateful for the introduction to Mrs. Summers. You can call me Will, madam, if you are comfortable with that. And I am Florence Kane. Will's face broke into a genuine smile, and Florence noticed for the first time that he had a small scar on his chin, and that his hands, though rough from work, were clean. Pleased to meet you properly, Miss Kane. Now, let me fetch your trunk from the station, and we can get you settled at the ranch. I have a wagon in town today picking up supplies, so the timing works out just fine. As Will strode off toward the station, Florence took her first deep breath since stepping off that train. Perhaps this disaster was not the end of everything after all. Perhaps, as Will had said, Robert Henderson had simply made room for something different, something better, though she could not imagine what that might be. The wagon ride to the Double Creek Ranch gave Florence her first real look at the Colorado landscape. The terrain was dramatic and harsh, nothing like the gentle rolling hills of Massachusetts. Red rock formations jutted from the earth like broken bones, and the vegetation was sparse and tough, adapted to survive in this unforgiving climate. Yet there was a wild beauty to it that caught at something in her chest. The sky seemed impossibly vast, a blue so deep it was almost painful, and the air smelled of sage and pine and dust. Will drove the wagon with easy competence, pointing out landmarks as they went. That peak there, that is called Horsefly Peak, and over there, see that line of cottonwoods. That marks the creek that runs through the ranch. Water is everything out here, Miss Kane. A ranch without good water is not worth having. How large is the Double Creek Ranch? Florence asked, genuinely curious. About 2,000 acres with maybe 300 head of cattle at last count. It is not the biggest operation in the area, but it is respectable. Mr. Summers, God rest him, built it up from nothing. He died 3 years back, thrown from a horse. Mrs. Summers has kept it running ever since, but it has not been easy. There are men around here who think a woman has no business running a ranch. And what do you think, Will? He glanced at her, surprised by the direct question. I think Mrs. Summers is as capable as any man I have worked for, maybe more so. She knows cattle, knows the land, and knows how to manage people fair. That is all that matters in my book. Florence found herself liking William Foster more with each passing moment. He spoke plainly but thoughtfully, and he seemed to possess both competence and kindness, a combination she had found rare in her experience. The ranch house came into view as they crested a low rise. It was a sprawling structure of wood and stone, built in an L shape with a wide porch running along the front. Outbuildings dotted the property: a large barn, a bunkhouse, several corrals, and various sheds and pens. Men moved about their work, and the sound of cattle lowing came from somewhere beyond the barn. Will pulled the wagon up in front of the house just as a woman emerged onto the porch. She was in her mid-40s, Florence guessed, with steel-gray hair pulled back in a practical bun and a face weathered by sun and hardship but still handsome. She wore a simple dress protected by a work apron, and her eyes were sharp and assessing. "Will Foster, whose trunk is that in the back of my supply wagon?" she called out, her voice carrying a note of amused curiosity. Will hopped down and then offered his hand to help Florence descend. "Mrs. Summers, this is Miss Florence Kane from Boston." She arrived in Montrose today expecting to marry Robert Henderson, but he took one look at her and rode off without a word. "She finds herself in need of employment and lodging, and I recalled you mentioning just last week that you needed help with the household. I took the liberty of offering her an introduction, with your permission." Mrs. Summers descended the porch steps and came to stand directly in front of Florence, looking her up and down with frank appraisal. Florence felt herself being measured and tried not to squirm under the scrutiny. "Robert Henderson is an even bigger fool than I thought," Mrs. Summers said finally. "Can you cook, Miss Kane?" "Yes, madam. I managed my mother's household for the past 5 years. I can cook, clean, sew, and keep accounts. I also have some education and could provide tutoring if your sons require it." "They do. Both of them can barely write their own names, which is a shame on me for not addressing it sooner. Can you ride?" Florence hesitated. "I have ridden a little in parks back east, but nothing like what I imagine is required here. You will learn. Everyone on a ranch needs to know how to handle a horse." Mrs. Summers nodded decisively. "Here are my terms. You will have a room in the house, meals with the family, and $3 a week. In exchange, you will manage the household, cook for me and my boys and Will here, since he eats with us more often than not, and provide lessons to my sons in the evenings. Sundays you have to yourself. Does that suit?" Relief flooded through Florence so intensely she felt dizzy. "Yes, madam." "That suits very well, thank you." "Do not thank me yet. You have not met my sons. They are 17 and 15, full of the devil and completely lacking in social graces. You will earn every penny of that $3, I promise you." "But Mrs." Summers smiled as she said it, and Florence saw the deep affection beneath the gruff words. "Will, help Miss Kane get settled in the spare room off the kitchen. Then I expect you to get those supplies unloaded before supper. Miss Kane, you can start your duties tomorrow. Tonight you will eat with us and rest from your journey." As Will carried her trunk into the house, Florence followed Mrs. Summers inside. The interior was clean but sparse, furnished with handmade furniture that was sturdy rather than elegant. Yet it felt like a home, lived in and loved, and Florence felt some of the tightness in her chest ease. The room Will showed her to was small but private, with a narrow bed, a washstand, a trunk at the foot of the bed, and a window that looked out toward the mountains. It was more than adequate, and after the uncertainty of the morning it felt like a sanctuary. "I will leave you to get settled," Will said, setting her trunk down carefully. "Supper is at 6. Just come through to the main room when you are ready. Will." Florence stopped him before he could leave. "Thank you, truly. I do not know what I would have done if you had not helped me." He turned back, and that gentle smile crossed his face again. "You would have figured something out, Miss Kane. You strike me as the resourceful type. I just helped move things along a bit faster." He settled his hat back on his head. "Welcome to the Double Creek." After he left, Florence sank onto the bed and finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of the day. She had been rejected, humiliated, and left stranded in a strange place. Yet here she was, with a roof over her head and employment, thanks to the intervention of a kind cowboy with gray-blue eyes and a Texas drawl. She thought about what he had said at the train station, about Robert Henderson making room for someone better, and wondered what he had meant by that. She unpacked a fresh dress and washed her face and hands in the basin, trying to make herself presentable for supper. Through the window, she could hear the sounds of the ranch, men calling to each other, horses nickering, the creak of wagon wheels and the thud of supplies being unloaded. It was all so different from Boston, from the life she had imagined she would have. Yet as she looked out at those distant mountains turning gold in the evening light, she felt something unexpected stir in her chest. Not quite hope, not yet, but perhaps the possibility of hope. Supper that evening was a revelation in many ways. Mrs. Summers' sons, James and Thomas, were indeed rough around the edges, but they were also polite enough once their mother gave them a sharp look. They studied Florence with open curiosity, but asked no rude questions about her sudden appearance at their table. The food was plain but abundant. Beef stew, fresh bread, butter, and dried apple pie for dessert. Will ate with them, as Mrs. Summers had indicated was his habit. He sat across from Florence, and she found herself watching him when she thought he was not looking. He had cleaned up before supper, his face scrubbed and his hair damp and combed back. He ate with good manners but obviously genuine hunger, and he engaged in easy conversation with the Summers family about the work of the ranch and the conditions of the herd. "We lost 2 calves to a mountain lion this week," James, the older son, reported. "Found tracks up in the north pasture." "I will ride out tomorrow and see if I can track it," Will said. "We cannot afford to lose more stock." "Be careful," Mrs. Summers said. "Mountain lions are nothing to take lightly." "No, madam." Will glanced at Florence. "What do you think of Colorado so far, Miss Kane?" All eyes turned to her, and Florence chose her words carefully. "It is very different from what I am accustomed to, but it is beautiful in its own way. The mountains are extraordinary." "Wait until winter," Thomas said, grinning. "You have not seen anything until you have seen a Colorado blizzard. Snow up to the eaves of the house, so cold your breath freezes before it leaves your mouth." "Thomas, do not scare our new guest," his mother chided, but she was smiling. "I am not easily scared," Florence said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "I came all the way from Boston by myself. I expect I can handle a bit of snow." Will's eyes met hers across the table, and she saw approval there, and something else she could not quite name. It made her pulse quicken inexplicably. After supper, Mrs. Summers showed Florence the kitchen and pantry, explaining her expectations and routines. "Breakfast is at 5:30, she said. "The men need to eat before they head out for the day. Dinner is at noon when they come in from the morning work, and supper at 6. It is a lot of cooking, I will not lie to you, but you will have help. Maria comes up from town 3 times a week to do laundry and heavy cleaning, and I will assist when I can, though I am often out with the herd. I understand. I will do my best. That is all anyone can ask, Mrs. Summers paused, her expression softening. "I am sorry about what happened to you today, Miss Kane. Robert Henderson always was a weak man, but I did not think even he would stoop so low. His loss is our gain, though, so I suppose we should thank him for his cowardice." That is the second time today someone has suggested I should be grateful to Mr. Henderson for his rejection, Florence said with a small smile. Perhaps you are right. Perhaps this is where I was meant to be all along. Perhaps it is, Mrs. Summers agreed. Now, get yourself some rest. 5:30 comes early, and you have had a long day. Florence retreated to her small room and changed into her nightgown. She lay in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch settling in for the night. Somewhere an owl hooted, and she could hear the soft lowing of cattle in the distance. She thought about Robert Henderson and was surprised to find that she felt more relief than heartbreak. She had never loved him, she realized. She had loved the idea of him, the promise of a new life and adventure. But the man himself had been a stranger, and apparently a stranger with no courage or honor. And then she thought about Will Foster, about his kindness and his gentle smile, about the way his eyes had held hers across the supper table. She told herself firmly that such thoughts were dangerous and pointless. He was simply a good man who had helped someone in need. That was all. She could not allow herself to read anything more into it. But as she drifted off to sleep, it was his voice she heard in her mind. Then he made room for someone better. The next morning, Florence woke before dawn to the sound of men's voices outside her window. She dressed quickly in a simple work dress and apron, pinned up her hair and made her way to the kitchen. To her surprise, Will was already there, building up the fire in the large cast-iron stove. "Good morning, Miss Kane," he said, looking up with a smile. "I figured I would get the stove going for you on your first day. It can be temperamental if you do not know its ways." "That is very thoughtful, thank you." She moved to the pantry to assess what she had to work with. What do the men usually have for breakfast? Whatever is filling. Bacon and eggs if there are any, biscuits, coffee strong enough to strip paint. We are not picky, but we work hard and we need fuel. Florence set to work with practiced efficiency. She had spent years cooking for her mother and managing their small household in Boston. This was on a larger scale, but the principles were the same. She mixed up biscuit dough, fried bacon in a large skillet, and scrambled eggs with butter and a bit of cream she found in the cold box. Within half an hour, the kitchen was filled with delicious smells, and Mrs. Summers appeared with her sons in tow. "My goodness, that smells wonderful," Mrs. Summers said, genuine pleasure in her voice. "I have not had a proper breakfast in months. I usually just throw together whatever is quickest." They ate together at the large kitchen table, and Florence felt a small glow of satisfaction at the appreciative comments from everyone. Will had seconds of everything, and told her the biscuits were the best he had eaten since leaving his mother's house in Texas. Florence found herself blushing at the compliment. After breakfast, the men headed out to their work, and Florence began the task of cleaning up and planning the midday meal. Mrs. Summers stayed to help for a while, showing her where everything was kept and explaining the rhythms of ranch life. "The men will be working on the south fence line today," she said. "They will come in hungry enough to eat a horse. We usually do something simple for dinner, stew or beans, something that can simmer while we are about other work. I can manage that. What about your son's lessons? When would you like me to start?" "After supper, for an hour or so before bed. They will complain, but they need it. I want them to have opportunities I did not have, and that requires education." Florence spent the morning exploring the kitchen and pantry, taking inventory of supplies and planning meals. She found the work soothing, giving structure to her thoughts and purpose to her day. Through the window, she could see men moving about the ranch, and occasionally she caught glimpses of Will, always seeming to be in motion, working with a horse in the corral or carrying something to the barn. Around mid-morning, she decided to make a dried apple cake for dessert that night, using fruit she found stored in the pantry. She was mixing the batter when she heard a knock at the kitchen door. She opened it to find Will standing there, his hat in his hands again, looking almost shy. "Sorry to disturb you, Miss Kane, but I was wondering if you might have any leftover coffee from breakfast. The pot in the bunkhouse has gone cold and tastes like mud besides." "Of course. Come in." She poured him a cup of the coffee she had kept warming on the back of the stove and handed it to him. "Would you like some of these biscuits as well? There are several left over." "That would be most welcome, thank you." He sat at the kitchen table at her gesture and ate the biscuit with obvious enjoyment. "You have a real talent for cooking, Miss Kane. That is a valuable skill out here." "I am glad I can be useful." She hesitated, then asked, "Will, may I ask you something?" "Of course." "Yesterday, at the train station, you said that Robert Henderson made room for someone better. What did you mean by that?" Will set down his coffee cup and looked at her directly, his gray-blue eyes serious. "I meant that sometimes what seems like the worst thing that can happen turns out to be a blessing in disguise. That man was not worthy of you, Miss Kane. Anyone could see that by his actions. So by running away like a coward, he made room in your life for people and experiences that will treat you better. Maybe he made room for true friends, or a real home, or work that satisfies you. Maybe he made room for love that is genuine, instead of based on letters and imagination." Florence felt her breath catch. That is a generous way of looking at it. It is an honest way of looking at it. Will stood, draining the last of his coffee. "Thank you for the refreshment, Miss Kane. I should get back to work." After he left, Florence stood at the window, watching him cross the yard to the barn, and felt something shift inside her chest. She barely knew this man, yet he had shown her more genuine kindness in one day than Robert Henderson had in a year of correspondence. She wondered what kind of life Will had led, what had brought him from Texas to Colorado, what dreams he harbored in his heart. The days began to fall into a rhythm. Florence rose before dawn, prepared breakfast for the household, spent her mornings cleaning and preparing the midday meal, and her afternoons on various household tasks. Mending, baking, preserving food, and learning the 1,000 small skills required to maintain a ranch household. In the evenings, after supper, she taught James and Thomas their letters and numbers. Both boys were brighter than their rough exteriors suggested, and they applied themselves to their lessons with surprising dedication, once they realized Florence would not condescend to them or make them feel stupid for their lack of education. Will was a constant, steady presence in those early days. He ate his meals with the family, and Florence found herself looking forward to those times when she could listen to him talk about the ranch, about the land, about his life. Gradually, in bits and pieces shared over coffee and pie, she learned his story. He had been born in Texas, the youngest of 4 brothers on a small ranch that barely supported the family. When he was 19, a drought had destroyed their livelihood, and the family had scattered, each seeking their fortune elsewhere. Will had drifted north, working various ranches, learning his trade until he had landed at the Double Creek 5 years ago. He was 27 now, still young but hardened by experience, and he had ambitions of one day owning his own land, building something that would last. In turn, Florence shared her own story. She told him about Boston, about caring for her widowed mother, about the monotony of her restricted life in the city. She told him about answering Robert Henderson's advertisement for a mail-order bride, about the hope she had felt at the prospect of a new life, and about the crushing disappointment of his rejection. "Do you regret coming west?" Will asked her one evening. They were sitting on the porch after supper, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of orange and purple. Mrs. Summers and her sons had gone to check on a mare that was due to foal, leaving Will and Florence alone for a rare moment of privacy. Florence considered the question carefully. "No," she said finally. "Not anymore. The first day, yes, I regretted everything. But now I see that this is better than what I would have had with Robert Henderson. Here I have purpose and independence. I am earning my own way. I have never done that before." "You have taken to ranch life better than I expected," Will said. "No offense intended, but I thought a Boston lady might find it all too rough." "I am not as delicate as I look," Florence said with a smile. "And I like the work. I like feeling useful. I like knowing that the meals I prepare sustain people who are doing important work. There is something honest about life here that was missing in Boston. Everything there was about appearances and propriety. Here, what matters is whether you can do the work and whether you treat people fairly." Will turned to look at her, and in the fading light his expression was intense. "You are not what I expected either, Miss Kane." "What did you expect? Someone more fragile, I suppose. Someone who would wilt under the harsh conditions. But you have steel in you. I saw it that first day at the train station, the way you held yourself together even when your world was falling apart. I admire that." Florence felt heat rise to her cheeks. "That is kind of you to say. It is honest, not kind. There is a difference." He paused, then added quietly, "I want you to know, Miss Kane, that I am glad I was at that station the day you arrived. I am glad I could help you, and I am glad you stayed." Before Florence could respond, Mrs. Summers called from the barn that the mare had foaled successfully, and the moment was broken. But as she lay in bed that night, Florence replayed Will's words over and over, hearing the warmth in his voice, seeing the way he had looked at her in the twilight. Something was growing between them, something neither of them had named yet, but that both could feel. It thrilled and frightened her in equal measure. Summer deepened into July, and the work of the ranch intensified. There was hay to cut and stack, cattle to move to higher pastures, endless maintenance on fences and buildings and equipment. Florence saw less of Will during the long daylight hours, as he was often out from before dawn until after dusk. But their brief encounters grew charged with an awareness that neither could quite hide. He began finding small excuses to seek her out. He would need a lunch packed for a long day of riding. He would ask her opinion on a book James was struggling with in his lessons. He would offer to help her carry heavy pots or reach items on high shelves. And Florence, for her part, began to watch for him, to listen for his voice in the yard, to feel her pulse quicken when he walked into a room. Mrs. Summers noticed, of course. She was far too observant not to. But she said nothing, only watched with thoughtful eyes and occasionally smiled to herself when she saw Will and Florence talking together. One Saturday afternoon, Will asked Florence if she would like to learn to ride properly. "You should know how," he said. "In case of emergency, or just so you can see more of the land. It is beautiful up in the higher country." Mrs. Summers encouraged the idea. "Take Sunday afternoon," she said. "You have been working so hard, Florence. You deserve some time away from the house." So on Sunday after the midday meal, Will brought around a gentle mare named Daisy and spent the afternoon teaching Florence the basics of riding. He was patient and encouraging, and though Florence felt awkward and uncertain at first, she gradually began to relax into the rhythm of the horse's gait. They rode out away from the ranch buildings, following a trail that wound along the creek and up into the hills. "There," Will said, pointing ahead. "That is my favorite spot on the whole ranch." They came to a small meadow ringed by pines with a view that stretched for miles across the valley. A natural spring bubbled up from the rocks, creating a small pool of clear water before flowing down to join the creek below. Wild flowers dotted the grass: blue columbine, red paintbrush and yellow sunflowers. They dismounted, and Will helped Florence down from her horse. His hands lingered at her waist a moment longer than strictly necessary, and when she looked up at him, his face was so close she could see gold flecks in his gray-blue eyes. "Florence," he said softly, using her first name for the first time without the formal miss attached. "I need to tell you something." Her heart was pounding so hard she was certain he could hear it. "What is it?" "Since the day you arrived in Montrose, since I saw you standing on that station platform trying so hard to be brave, I have not been able to stop thinking about you. At first I told myself I was just trying to help someone in need, but it has become more than that. You have become important to me, more important than I know how to say." Florence could barely breathe. "Will, let me finish, please. I know I have no right to speak of such things. I am just a cowboy with no prospects beyond my wages. You are an educated woman from a good family back east, but I cannot keep silent anymore. Florence, I care for you, deeply. And I hope that maybe you feel something for me too." "I do," Florence whispered. "I've been trying not to, trying to tell myself it was impossible, but I do. You have been so kind to me, so good. You make me feel safe and valued," and she broke off, suddenly shy. "And what?" Will prompted gently, his hand still at her waist, holding her as if she were something precious. "And you make me feel things I have never felt before, things I did not know I could feel." Will's face broke into a smile that transformed his whole expression. "Then I am the luckiest man in Colorado," he said. "May I kiss you, Florence?" "Yes," she breathed. He cupped her face in his calloused hands and kissed her with a tenderness that made her knees weak. It was nothing like the chaste kisses she had read about in books. It was warm and real and made her feel as if she were falling and flying at the same time. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard and Will rested his forehead against hers. "I want to court you properly," he said. "I want to do this right. I know I cannot offer you much yet, but I am saving money. In another year, maybe two, I will have enough to buy my own land, start my own ranch. I want to build something permanent, something lasting, and I want to build it with you if you will have me." Tears stung Florence's eyes, but they were happy tears. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will have you. I want that future with you, Will. I want to build a life together." They sat by the spring for hours, talking and dreaming about the future they would create together. Will told her about the land he had his eye on, a section of valley land with good water and grazing. Florence told him about the kind of home she wanted to make, not grand but comfortable, a place filled with love and laughter. They kissed again and again, exploring this new intimacy with joy and wonder. When they finally rode back to the ranch as the sun was setting, Florence felt as if she were glowing from within. Everything looked different now, brighter and more full of possibility. The ranch she had come to by accident had become her home, and the cowboy who had helped her was now the man she loved. Mrs. Summers met them in the yard, and one look at their faces told her everything. She smiled broadly. "Well," she said, "it is about time. I have been waiting for you two to figure out what was obvious to everyone else." That evening, as they sat together on the porch, Will holding Florence's hand while they watched the stars emerge, Florence marveled at how completely her life had changed. Just weeks ago, she had been standing on a train platform, humiliated and lost. Now she was surrounded by people who cared for her, doing work she found meaningful, and in love with a man who treated her with respect and tenderness. "I need to send a letter to my mother," she said suddenly. "I need to tell her that I am all right, that I am happy. She will have been worried." "Tell her you have found a home," Will said. "Tell her you have found where you belong." "I will tell her I found more than that," Florence said, squeezing his hand. "I will tell her I found love." The summer weeks passed in a haze of happiness. Will courted Florence properly, with Mrs. Summers' blessing and the teasing approval of James and Thomas. They went on rides together every Sunday, exploring more of the ranch land and the surrounding territory. Will showed her places he loved: a waterfall hidden in a canyon, a stand of aspens that would turn gold in autumn, a high ridge where you could see 3 mountain ranges in the distance. They talked about everything and nothing. Florence learned that Will loved to read, whenever he could get his hands on a book, and that his favorite was a battered copy of adventure stories he had carried with him from Texas. Will learned that Florence played the piano, though there was no piano at the ranch, and that she loved thunderstorms, the more dramatic the better. They discovered that they both wanted children, several of them, and that they both believed in treating all people with dignity, regardless of their station. Will also began teaching Florence the practical skills of ranch life. She learned to ride well enough to be useful, to rope a calf, to recognize signs of sickness in cattle. She learned to shoot a rifle, which made her nervous at first, but Will was patient and insisted she needed to know how to protect herself. She learned to read the weather, to understand the patterns of the land and animals, to see the world through the eyes of someone who lived close to nature. Florence thrived on the work and the learning. She had never felt so capable, so strong. The woman who had stepped off the train in June had been timid and uncertain, defined by other people's expectations. The woman she was becoming was confident and skilled, forging her own path. In late July, a letter arrived from her mother in Boston. Florence opened it with trembling hands, afraid of what it might say. But her mother's words were kind and understanding. She wrote that she was relieved Florence was safe and well situated, and that she had never been entirely comfortable with the arrangement with Robert Henderson, whom she had always suspected of being less honorable than he presented himself. She gave Florence her blessing to make her own way and to follow her heart, and asked only that Florence write regularly and perhaps come visit one day, or better yet, that she might come visit Colorado and meet the people her daughter spoke of with such obvious affection. Florence cried as she read the letter, and Will held her while she did, understanding that they were tears of relief and release. "She approves," Florence told him. "She wants me to be happy." "Then I like her already," Will said. "And one day I will tell her in person that I will spend my life making sure you are." In August, the ranch hands drove a portion of the herd to market in Grand Junction, and Will went with them. He was gone for nearly 2 weeks, and Florence was surprised by how much she missed him. The house felt emptier without his presence, and meals were less enjoyable without his conversation. She realized with some wonder that she had become accustomed to loving him, that it was now simply part of who she was, woven into the fabric of her daily life. When the men returned, Will sought her out immediately, sweeping her into his arms in front of everyone and kissing her soundly, to the whoops and hollers of the other ranch hands and the delighted laughter of Mrs. Summers and her sons. "I have something for you," he said, pulling a small package from his pocket. Inside was a simple silver locket on a chain. "It is not much," he said, suddenly shy. "But I wanted you to have something from me, something you could wear and remember that you are loved." Florence opened the locket and found 2 tiny photographs inside, one of Will, taken at a shop in Grand Junction, and one blank space. "That space is for your picture," Will explained, "so we can be together even when we are apart." "It is perfect," Florence said, tears streaming down her face. "Help me put it on." He fastened the chain around her neck, and she touched the locket, feeling its weight against her heart. "I will treasure it always," she promised. That evening Will spoke privately with Mrs. Summers. Florence did not know what was said, but afterward Mrs. Summers sought her out in the kitchen where she was washing dishes. "Will has asked my permission to marry you," she said without preamble. "I told him I thought it was an excellent idea provided you agreed. He wanted my blessing before he officially proposed. He is a good man, Florence. One of the best I have known. You will be happy with him." "I know," Florence said, her heart full. "I already am happy with him. I cannot imagine my life without him now." "Then I expect there will be a proposal coming soon," Mrs. Summers said with a smile. "And when you two are married, you will always have a place here, both of you, for as long as you need or want it. This ranch is your home." The proposal came on a Sunday evening in early September. The days were growing shorter, and there was a hint of autumn in the air, a crispness that spoke of the changing season. Will and Florence rode up to their meadow, the place where they had first confessed their feelings for each other. The aspen trees were just beginning to turn gold at their edges, and the light was that particular slanting amber that only comes in early autumn. They spread a blanket by the spring and sat together, watching the sun sink toward the mountains. Will was nervous, Florence could tell, fidgeting with his hat and clearing his throat several times before he finally spoke. "Florence, when I first saw you at that train station, you looked like the whole world had fallen apart around you. I wanted to help you because it was the right thing to do. But somewhere between that moment and this one, you became the most important person in my life. You are the first thing I think of when I wake up and the last thing I think of before I sleep. You make me want to be a better man, to work harder, to build something worthy of you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. "I do not have much to offer you yet, but I have my health, my will to work, and a heart that is entirely yours. Will you marry me, Florence? Will you be my wife and my partner and help me build the life we have been dreaming of?" He opened the box to reveal a simple gold band with a small diamond, modest but lovely. "I know it is not fancy," he said quickly, "but it is all I could afford right now. One day I will buy you something grander." "No," Florence interrupted, taking the box from his hands. "This is perfect." "It is from you, and that makes it perfect." "Yes, Will. Yes, I will marry you. I cannot think of anything I want more in this world than to be your wife." Will slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. Then he kissed her, deeply and passionately, and Florence felt as if her heart might burst from happiness. This man, this good and honest man who had appeared in her life at her lowest moment, was going to be her husband. They would build a life together, face challenges together, create a family together. It was more than she had ever dared hope for. They rode back to the ranch as the stars came out and announced their engagement to Mrs. Summers and her sons. There was celebration and congratulations, and Mrs. Summers insisted on breaking out a bottle of whiskey her late husband had been saving for special occasions. They toasted to the future, to love, to new beginnings. "I think we should have the wedding here," Mrs. Summers said. "Right here on the ranch in October when the aspens are at their peak. We will invite everyone from the neighboring ranches and make a proper celebration of it." Florence agreed immediately. She could think of nowhere she would rather be married than on this land that had become her home, surrounded by the people who had become her family. Will looked at her with such love and gratitude that she felt tears sting her eyes again. "Then it is settled," Mrs. Summers declared. "We have a wedding to plan." The next weeks were a flurry of activity. Florence wrote to her mother with the news, inviting her to come for the wedding if her health permitted the journey. She also wrote a brief, formal letter to Robert Henderson, informing him that she bore him no ill will and thanking him for his cowardice, which had led her to a far better life than she would have had with him. She did not expect a response, and she did not receive one. Mrs. Summers threw herself into wedding preparations with enthusiasm. She knew every ranching family in the region, and she spread the word about the upcoming celebration. Gifts began to arrive: quilts and preserved foods and small household items to help the couple start their life together. The community that Florence had been nervous about joining embraced her warmly, and she realized that out here, where life was hard and neighbors were scarce, people took care of each other. Florence's mother wrote back that she would make the journey, health permitting, and that she would arrive a week before the wedding. Florence was overjoyed at the prospect of her mother meeting Will and seeing the life she had built in Colorado. Will continued his work on the ranch, but in the evenings he and Florence would sit together and plan their future in detail. Will had been saving his wages diligently for 5 years, and he had nearly enough to make an offer on the land he wanted. Mrs. Summers had promised to help if they were short, as an investment in their future. They planned to build a small house, just a few rooms at first, with the intention of expanding as their family grew. Will had a talent for woodworking, and he sketched out designs while Florence suggested modifications and additions. "I want a big kitchen," she said, "with lots of windows so I can see the mountains while I work, and a porch where we can sit in the evenings." "Then that is what you will have," Will promised. "I will build you the finest house I can manage, Florence. It may not be grand, but it will be filled with love." "That is all I need," she assured him. In late September, Florence's mother arrived on the train in Montrose. Will and Florence went to meet her, and Florence was struck by how frail her mother looked, how much she had aged in just a few months. But her mother's eyes were bright with happiness as she embraced her daughter. "Let me look at you," her mother said, holding Florence at arm's length. "Why, you look wonderful, dear, positively glowing. This life agrees with you." "It does, Mother. I am happier than I have ever been." Florence turned to Will, who stood nervously behind her. "Mother, this is William Foster, my intended. Will, this is my mother, Mrs. Caroline Kane." Will removed his hat and offered his hand with a respectful nod. "Mrs. Kane, I am honored to meet you. Your daughter speaks of you often and with great love." Florence's mother studied him with the sharp eye of a woman who had not been easily fooled in her life. Then she smiled. "Mr. Foster, I can see that you are a good man. I can see it in the way you look at my daughter and in the way she looks at you. You have my blessing and my gratitude for making her so happy." "I intend to spend my life making her happy, madam," Will said earnestly. "You have my word on that." The drive back to the ranch was filled with conversation as Florence's mother asked questions about the area and the ranch and the life Florence had built. When they arrived at the Double Creek, Mrs. Summers greeted Florence's mother with warm hospitality, showing her to the guest room and insisting she rest from her journey. That evening at supper, Florence watched her mother interact with the Summers family and Will, and she could see her mother's approval growing. Her mother particularly liked Mrs. Summers, recognizing in her a kindred spirit, a strong woman who had faced hardship and persevered. After supper, Florence walked with her mother in the yard, showing her around the ranch in the fading light. "Are you truly happy here, Florence?" her mother asked. "Tell me honestly. I know you are in love, but love is not always enough. Can you be content with this life so different from what you knew?" Florence thought carefully before answering. "Mother, I am not just happy, I am fulfilled. In Boston, I felt like I was waiting for my life to begin, living in the shadows of other people's expectations. Here, I am building something real. I am contributing to something larger than myself. And yes, I am in love with a man who respects me and treats me as an equal partner. This is the life I was meant to live. I am certain of it." Her mother embraced her, tears in her eyes. "Then I am happy for you, truly. And I am at peace knowing you have found where you belong." The wedding took place on a perfect October afternoon when the aspens were at their peak of autumn glory, painting the mountainsides in shimmering gold. Mrs. Summers and Maria had worked tirelessly to prepare the ranch for the celebration. Tables were set up in the yard, laden with food that the neighboring families had contributed: roasted beef and chicken, fresh bread and biscuits, vegetables from late gardens, pies and cakes of every description. Bunting and ribbons decorated the porch, and wild flowers were gathered into bouquets. The ceremony itself was held outdoors, with the mountains as their backdrop. The local circuit preacher, a jovial man named Reverend Williams, officiated. Florence wore a simple dress of cream-colored silk that Mrs. Summers had helped her make, with a crown of wild flowers in her hair. She had never felt more beautiful. Will wore his Sunday best, his hair neatly trimmed, his boots polished to a shine. But it was the look in his eyes as Florence walked toward him that made her feel like the most precious woman in the world. James and Thomas stood up with Will as his groomsmen, and Mrs. Summers stood with Florence as her matron of honor. Florence's mother watched from the front row, tears streaming down her face. The vows were simple but heartfelt. When Will promised to love, honor, and cherish Florence for all the days of his life, his voice rang with sincerity. And when Florence made the same promise in return, she meant every word with her whole heart. When Reverend Williams pronounced them husband and wife, and Will kissed her for the first time as her husband, cheers erupted from the assembled guests. The celebration lasted well into the night. There was music and dancing, and Florence was whirled around by seemingly every man present, though she always found her way back to Will. They cut the wedding cake, a magnificent 3-layer creation that Mrs. Summers had somehow managed to produce, and toasted with cider and whiskey. Stories were told, jokes were made, and the warm community spirit of the ranching families was on full display. As the evening drew to a close, Will and Florence slipped away from the celebration. Mrs. Summers had given them the use of a small cabin on the ranch property for their wedding night, a place where they could be alone and private. Will carried Florence over the threshold, both of them laughing, and set her down gently in the small but cozy room that had been prepared for them. A fire burned in the hearth, and candles cast a soft glow over the space. Someone, probably Mrs. Summers, had left a bottle of wine and 2 glasses on the table. Will poured them each a glass, and they toasted to their future. "I cannot believe you are my wife," Will said, his voice filled with wonder. "Sometimes I think I will wake up and find this has all been a dream." "It is not a dream," Florence assured him, setting down her glass and moving into his arms. "This is real. We are real. And we have the rest of our lives to build our dreams together." That night, as Will made love to her for the first time with tenderness and passion, Florence understood what it meant to truly belong to someone, and to have them belong to you. They were partners now in every sense, bound together by love and commitment and shared dreams for the future. In the morning, they emerged from the cabin to find the ranch had been cleaned up from the celebration, and life had returned to its normal rhythms. But everything felt different now. Florence was no longer Miss Kane, the mail-order bride who had been rejected. She was Mrs. Foster, wife to a good man, part of a community that had accepted her. She had a place and a purpose, and a love that filled her heart to overflowing. Will returned to his work on the ranch, but now he and Florence had their own plans to work toward. In his spare time, Will began building their house on the land he had purchased with his savings and a small loan from Mrs. Summers. Florence helped when she could, learning to use hammer and nails alongside him. Slowly, over the fall and winter months, the house took shape. A simple 4-room structure with a large kitchen, a main room, and 2 bedrooms. It had the big windows Florence had requested, and the wide porch Will had promised. Florence continued her work at the Double Creek, cooking and keeping house and teaching James and Thomas, who were both making excellent progress with their studies. But now she went home to her own place in the evenings, walking the mile from the ranch house to her own home where Will would be waiting for her. It was a good life, full of hard work but also full of joy. Winter in Colorado was indeed as dramatic as Thomas had promised. The snows came heavy and deep, and for weeks at a time they were largely confined to the house and immediate ranch property. But Florence found she did not mind. The house was snug and warm, and she spent the long winter evenings with Will, reading by firelight, planning their future, and learning more about each other every day. They talked about the children they would have, the improvements they would make to their property, the life they would build together over the years. Florence's mother stayed through Christmas before returning to Boston, and by then she was thoroughly convinced of her daughter's happiness. "You have done well, Florence," she told her daughter before boarding the train. "Better than I ever hoped. That man loves you truly and you love him. That is a rare and precious thing. Hold on to it." "I will, Mother, I promise." Spring came eventually, as it always does, turning the brown landscape green again and filling the meadows with wild flowers. In April, Florence realized she was carrying their first child. She told Will one evening as they sat on their porch watching the sunset, and the joy on his face was something she would remember for the rest of her life. "A baby," he said, his voice filled with awe. "We are going to have a baby. Florence, you have made me the happiest man alive." "I am happy too," she said, leaning into his embrace. "I am happy and grateful and so full of love I feel like I might burst." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the summer. Florence continued her work at the ranch as long as she was able with Mrs. Summers fussing over her and making sure she did not overdo it. Will was constantly worried, hovering over her and trying to prevent her from doing anything strenuous, which Florence found both endearing and occasionally exasperating. "I am not made of glass," she told him more than once. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. I will be fine." But she loved him for his concern, for the way he would rest his hand on her growing belly and talk to the baby, telling their child about the world it would soon enter, about the land they would inherit, about how much it was already loved. In November, on a cold, clear night when the stars seemed close enough to touch, Florence went into labor. Mrs. Summers and Maria attended her, along with a midwife from town, while Will paced anxiously outside the bedroom. It was a long labor, lasting through the night and into the next day, but finally, as the sun was setting on a second evening, Florence gave birth to a healthy baby boy. When Will was allowed into the room, he approached the bed with tears streaming down his face. Florence, exhausted but radiant, held out their son to him. "Meet our son," she said softly. Will took the baby with careful reverence, cradling him against his chest. "He is perfect," Will whispered. "Absolutely perfect. Hello, little one. I am your father, and I am going to love you and protect you for all of my days." They named him Thomas William Foster, Thomas after Will's father, who had died when Will was young, and William for his father. Thomas was a good baby, healthy and strong, with his mother's blue eyes and his father's dark hair. Will was a devoted father, coming home every evening eager to hold his son and help with his care. Florence had never seen anything more beautiful than the sight of her strong cowboy husband cradling their tiny baby with such tenderness. The years that followed were full of hard work, but also full of joy. Will's ranch prospered slowly but steadily. He was a careful manager and a skilled cattleman, and his reputation for fair dealing and honest work brought him respect in the community. Florence divided her time between caring for their growing family and continuing to help Mrs. Summers at the Double Creek, though as their own home and family demanded more of her attention, she gradually transitioned away from the ranch work. 2 years after Thomas was born, Florence gave birth to a daughter they named Caroline, after Florence's mother. Caroline had her mother's blonde hair and her father's gray-blue eyes, and she was a spirited, curious child who kept her parents constantly on their toes. Will doted on his daughter, and Florence loved watching them together, seeing this strong man rendered completely helpless by a little girl's smile. Life was not without its challenges. There were years when drought made grazing scarce and they struggled to keep their herd healthy. There were winters so harsh they lost cattle to cold and starvation. There were times when money was tight and they had to make difficult choices about what to prioritize. But they faced every challenge together, as partners, and their love for each other and for their children carried them through the hard times. Mrs. Summers eventually handed over more and more of the ranch operations to her sons, who had grown into capable young men. James married a girl from a neighboring ranch, and Thomas announced his intention to go to college in Denver, using the education Florence had given him as a foundation. Mrs. Summers herself remained a constant presence in Will and Florence's lives, a beloved friend and surrogate mother to them both. Florence's mother passed away peacefully in her sleep when little Caroline was 3 years old. Florence grieved deeply, but she was grateful that her mother had lived to see her happy and settled, and had met both of her grandchildren. Will held her through her tears, and helped her plan a memorial service at their small church, attended by the entire community that had come to love the gentle Boston woman who had adapted so well to ranch life. When Thomas was 6 and Caroline was 4, Florence gave birth to another son, whom they named James after Mrs. Summers' eldest son. James was a quiet, thoughtful child, quite different from his boisterous older brother and lively sister, but he had a gentle heart that endeared him to everyone. One evening, when their children were in bed and Will and Florence sat on their porch as they so often did, watching the stars come out over the mountains, Will turned to his wife and took her hand. "You remember that day at the train station?" he asked, "when Robert Henderson rode away?" "Of course I remember. It was one of the worst days of my life, or so I thought at the time. I have been thinking about it lately," Will said. "About what I said to you that day. I told you that he made room for someone better. I meant me, of course, though I was too shy to say it outright. But Florence, I think I had it backwards. He did not make room for me. He made room for this." Will gestured at their house, their land, the life they had built together. "He made room for the life you were meant to have, the life we were meant to build together. And I thank God every day for his cowardice, because it brought you to me." Florence felt tears prick her eyes, as she so often did when Will spoke from his heart. "I thank God for it, too. I thought I was coming west to marry Robert Henderson, but really I was coming west to find you, to find home, to find where I belonged." "And where do you belong, Mrs. Foster?" Will asked with a smile. "Right here," Florence said, leaning into his embrace. "Right here beside you always." They sat together in comfortable silence, listening to the sounds of the Colorado night, the wind in the pines, the distant call of an owl, the soft lowing of cattle settling down for the evening. Inside their house, their 3 children slept peacefully. All around them was the land they had built their lives on, the home they had created with love and hard work and determination. Florence thought back to that frightened, rejected woman who had stood on the Montrose train platform all those years ago, and she barely recognized herself in that memory. She had become someone so much stronger, so much more capable, so much more fully herself. And it was all because a kind cowboy with gray-blue eyes had offered her his help, and then his friendship, and then his heart. "I love you, Will Foster," she said softly. "And I love you, Florence Foster," he replied. Today, tomorrow, and always. The years continued to unfold with their mixture of joys and sorrows, triumphs and challenges. Thomas grew into a tall, capable young man who loved the ranch life and worked alongside his father with increasing skill. Caroline proved to have her mother's intelligence and her father's determination, and Florence began teaching her the same skills she had learned, preparing her to be a strong, independent woman. James remained quiet and thoughtful, but showed an early talent for drawing and an interest in the natural world that delighted both his parents. Will's ranch continued to grow, and he earned a reputation as one of the most respected cattlemen in the region. He never forgot the kindness Mrs. Summers had shown him, and he made a point of helping younger cowboys the way she had helped him, giving chances to men who might otherwise have none. Florence's kitchen became known as a place where anyone in need could find a hot meal and a listening ear, and their home was often filled with neighbors and friends, especially during the hard winters when community support was essential for survival. When Thomas turned 18, Will began the process of transferring more responsibility to him, teaching him the business side of ranching in addition to the physical work. "One day this will be yours," Will told his son. "All of it, everything your mother and I have built. I want you to be ready to take it on and make it even better." Thomas took the responsibility seriously, and Florence often saw echoes of Will in their son. The same steady competence, the same quiet integrity, the same capacity for hard work. It made her proud and a little wistful, seeing how quickly her children were growing up. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Will surprised Florence with a trip to Denver. They left the children in the care of Mrs. Summers, who was delighted to spoil her honorary grandchildren for a week, and took the train to the city. It was Florence's first visit to a real city since leaving Boston, and she was struck by how much Denver had grown. But she was also struck by how little she missed city life. The noise and crowds felt overwhelming after years of open spaces and small communities. They stayed in a fine hotel, ate in restaurants, attended a theater performance, and visited museums. It was a wonderful adventure, but Florence found herself thinking of home constantly, missing her children, missing the mountains, missing the life they had built. When they returned to the ranch, she felt a profound sense of relief and rightness, and she knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. "Thank you for the trip," she told Will as they pulled up to their house, their children running out to greet them. "It was wonderful. But this is what I want. This is all I will ever want." Will smiled and kissed her softly. "That is good because this is all I have to offer, but I offer it with all my heart." As the years moved on, Florence's hair began to show threads of silver, and Will's face gained more lines around his eyes and mouth. But the love between them only deepened with time. They had weathered storms together, both literal and metaphorical. They had built something lasting and true. They had raised children who were growing into good, capable adults. They had created a home that was filled with love and laughter. Mrs. Summers, now in her 70s, finally retired from active ranch work, though she remained a vital presence in all their lives. She often said that watching Will and Florence build their life together was one of her greatest joys. "You two restored my faith in love," she told them once. "After I lost my husband, I thought I would never believe in happy endings again, but you proved me wrong." On a spring day in their 15th year of marriage, Florence and Will stood on the porch of their house watching their children play in the yard. Thomas was now 23, engaged to a lovely young woman from a neighboring ranch. Caroline was 15, already showing signs of becoming a formidable woman. And James, at 13, was sketching the mountains in a notebook, his young face serious with concentration. "We have done well," Will said, putting his arm around Florence's waist. "Look at what we have built. Look at the life we have created." Florence leaned into her husband's embrace, feeling the same rush of love she had felt all those years ago in the meadow when he first kissed her. "We have done more than well. We have lived the life we were meant to live." "Do you ever think about how different things would have been if Robert Henderson had not ridden away that day?" Will asked. Florence considered the question. "Sometimes, but only to be grateful that he did. If he had not, I would have married him out of obligation and lived a life that was never meant to be mine. I would never have known you, never had our children, never built this home. His rejection was the greatest gift he could have given me, though he did not mean it as such." "Then he made room for me," Will said, echoing the words he had spoken so many years ago on that train platform. "No," Florence corrected gently. "He made room for us. For this family, this life, this love. He made room for everything that truly matters." They stood together in silence, watching their children and the land they had built their life on, both grateful beyond measure for the twisted path that had brought them together. Florence thought about the telegram she still had, tucked away in a drawer, the one that had brought her west to marry a man who had never deserved her. She thought about standing on that platform, heartbroken and lost, not knowing that the greatest love of her life was just moments away from introducing himself. "I want to tell you something," Florence said suddenly. "Something I have never said before, but I think needs to be said." "What is it?" Will asked, turning to look at her. "I am glad Robert Henderson was a coward. I am glad he saw me and rode away without a word. Because if he had been braver, if he had been honorable, if he had done the right thing, I would be with him right now. I would be living a life of duty and obligation, married to a man I could never truly love. Instead, I am here with you, living a life of passion and purpose, married to the man who owns my whole heart. So yes, I am grateful to Robert Henderson, not in spite of his cowardice but because of it. He freed me to find my true destiny." Will's eyes were bright with emotion. "Florence Foster, you are the most extraordinary woman I have ever known. You took a moment of rejection and humiliation and turned it into something beautiful. You built a life that is full of meaning and love. You raised 3 amazing children. You became a vital part of this community. You made me a better man simply by loving me. I am the one who should be grateful, every single day, that I was at that train station when you arrived." They kissed then, as the sun set over the mountains and their children laughed in the yard, and Florence felt the same electricity she had felt at their first kiss all those years ago. Some loves fade with time, worn down by the realities of daily life. But theirs had only grown stronger, deepened by shared experiences and mutual respect and the conscious choice, made every day, to love each other well. As Thomas entered his mid-20s, he married his sweetheart in a beautiful ceremony at the ranch, and within a year, he and his wife presented Will and Florence with their first grandchild, a boy they named William after his grandfather. Will was utterly besotted with his grandson, and Florence delighted in watching her husband experience the joy of a new generation. Caroline, now grown into a beautiful and intelligent young woman, surprised everyone by announcing her intention to study medicine. It was an unusual choice for a woman, but Florence supported her daughter completely, having learned herself that women were capable of far more than society typically allowed. With her parents' blessing and financial support, Caroline went east to study, though she promised to return to Colorado to practice, wanting to serve the community that had raised her. James continued to develop his artistic talents, and his sketches and paintings of Colorado landscapes began to attract attention. Florence encouraged his passion while also making sure he learned practical skills, understanding that art alone might not support him. But she believed in his talent and his vision, and she wanted him to have the freedom to pursue his dreams. As Florence and Will moved into their 40s, their love settled into something comfortable and enduring, like a well-worn pair of boots that fit perfectly. They knew each other completely, understood each other's moods and needs, could communicate with a glance or a touch. They still made love with passion, still found joy in each other's company, still chose each other every day. The ranch continued to prosper, and Will was able to expand their holdings, purchasing additional land and increasing their herd. But he never forgot where he came from, and he remained humble and generous, quick to help neighbors in need and fair in all his dealings. Florence's reputation as a cook and homemaker was legendary in the region, and young women often came to her for advice on managing households and families. One summer day, when Florence was 45 years old, she received an unexpected visitor. A man rode up to the house on a fine horse, dressed in expensive clothes that spoke of wealth and success. When he removed his hat, Florence did not recognize him at first, but when he spoke, introducing himself, she felt a jolt of shock. It was Robert Henderson. He looked older, heavier, with a dissipated quality to his features that spoke of hard living. He asked to speak with her, and Florence, after a moment's hesitation, invited him to sit on the porch. Will was out with the herd but would be back soon, and Florence felt no fear, only curiosity. "Mrs. Foster," Robert began, his voice hesitant. "I owe you an apology. I owe you more than an apology. I owe you my thanks." Florence waited, saying nothing. "I was a coward," Robert continued. "When you stepped off that train, I panicked. I had built up this image in my mind of who you would be, and when I saw the real you, I got scared. Not because there was anything wrong with you, but because I realized I was not ready for marriage, for responsibility, for any of it. So I ran. I have regretted it every day since." "Why are you here now?" Florence asked calmly. "To apologize and to see if you are all right. I have carried guilt about what I did for all these years. I have wondered what became of you, whether you made it back to Boston safely, whether you hated me." Florence considered her response carefully. "Mr. Henderson, I will not lie and say what you did was not hurtful, because it was. But I will also tell you that you did me the greatest favor anyone has ever done me, though you did not mean to. By running away, you freed me to find my true path. I met my husband the same day you rejected me. He helped me when I needed it most, and we fell in love. We have been married for more than 20 years now. We have 3 children, a grandchild, and a life that is full of love and meaning. So while your actions were cowardly, the results were wonderful. I am happy, Mr. Henderson, happier than I ever would have been with you." Robert looked at her with something like awe. "Then I am glad. I am glad something good came from my weakness. You look well, Mrs. Foster. You look happy." "I am." Florence heard the sound of horses approaching and knew it was Will returning. "My husband is here. Would you like to meet him?" "No," Robert said, standing and replacing his hat. "No, I think I should go. I just needed to know you were all right. Thank you for speaking with me." He mounted his horse and rode away just as Will came into the yard. Will dismounted and came up onto the porch, looking after the departing rider with curiosity. "Who was that?" he asked. "That," Florence said, taking her husband's hand, "was Robert Henderson." Will's eyes widened. "What did he want?" "To apologize and to see if I was happy. I told him I was happier than I ever could have been with him. I told him you were the best thing that ever happened to me." Will pulled her into his arms. "Did you really tell him that?" "I did, because it is true. You saved me that day, Will. Not just from a difficult situation, but from a life that would never have been right for me. You saved me, and then you loved me, and then you built this beautiful life with me. I will never stop being grateful for that." "Then we are both grateful," Will said. "To that coward who made room for us." They never saw Robert Henderson again, and Florence gave him very little thought after that day. He was part of her past, but her present and future were filled with Will and their family and the life they continued to build together. The years continued their steady march. Thomas and his wife had 2 more children, and the house was often filled with the laughter of grandchildren. Caroline returned from medical school and set up practice in Montrose, becoming the first female doctor in the region and earning respect through her skill and dedication. James sold his first painting to a gallery in Denver, and commissions began to come his way, allowing him to support himself through his art while still maintaining close ties to the ranch and family. Mrs. Summers passed away peacefully at the age of 80, surrounded by her sons and the extended family that included Will and Florence. At her funeral, Will spoke about the kindness she had shown him as a young cowboy with nothing to his name, and how she had taught him the value of giving others chances. Florence wept for the woman who had become a second mother to her, who had accepted her without question when she needed acceptance most. As Will and Florence moved into their 50s, they began to slow down a bit, though both remained active and involved in the ranch. They handed over more of the daily operations to Thomas, but continued to provide guidance and wisdom when needed. They spent more time with their grandchildren, passing on stories and skills and values. They took long rides together into the mountains, revisiting the places that held special meaning for them. On their 25th wedding anniversary, their entire family gathered for a celebration. All 3 of their children were there with their families, creating a house full of noise and love and laughter. Will made a speech, telling the story of how he and Florence had met, how he had seen her on that train platform looking lost and brave at the same time, how he had known even then that she was special. "Your mother changed my life," he told their children and grandchildren. "She came west expecting one thing and found something completely different. But she adapted and thrived and made a place for herself through hard work and courage and grace. She taught me what real love looks like, what real partnership means. And she gave me all of you, which is the greatest gift I could ever receive." Florence cried happy tears and told her own version of the story, about the cowboy who had appeared when she needed him most, who had treated her with respect and kindness, who had seen her worth when she could not see it herself. "Your father is the best man I have ever known," she told their children. "He is honest and hardworking and kind. He loves deeply and loyally, and he has given me a life beyond anything I could have imagined when I stepped off that train so many years ago. I love him more today than I did on our wedding day, and I will love him more tomorrow than I do today. That is what real love is, not a static thing but something that grows and deepens with time." The celebration lasted late into the night, with music and dancing and storytelling. As Florence watched her family, she marveled at the fullness of her life. From that moment of rejection and despair had grown all of this. 3 children, 4 grandchildren so far, a ranch that prospered, a community that valued them, a love that had sustained them through decades. When the guests finally departed and the house was quiet, Will and Florence sat on their porch one more time, wrapped in blankets against the cool autumn air. The stars blazed overhead in the clear mountain sky, and the familiar sounds of the ranch surrounded them. 25 years, Will mused. A quarter of a century, it seems like both forever and no time at all. "I know what you mean," Florence agreed. "Sometimes I feel like that young woman on the train platform was someone else entirely. But then I remember that girl is still inside me, that her dreams and hopes are what built this life. I am glad I was at that station," Will said. "I am glad I saw you and decided to help. It was the best decision I ever made." and I am glad I accepted your help. I could have been too proud, too embarrassed, but something told me to trust you, and I am so grateful I listened to that voice." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, hands clasped, shoulders touching, content in each other's presence. After a quarter-century of marriage, words were often unnecessary. They could simply be together, sharing space and breath and the quiet joy of enduring love. "You know what I have been thinking about lately?" Florence asked eventually. "What is that? Legacy. What we leave behind. We have built this ranch, raised these children, become part of this community. But what I am most proud of is the love we have created, the family we have nurtured. Long after we are gone, our children and grandchildren will remember what we built together. They will tell stories about us. They will try to love their own partners the way we loved each other. That is a legacy worth having." "It is," Will agreed. "And it all started with a rejection and a helping hand. Funny how life works out." "Not funny," Florence corrected. "Miraculous. We were given a second chance, both of us. You gave me a chance at a new life when mine had fallen apart, and I gave you a chance at the family and love you had always wanted. We were gifts to each other, Will. We still are." Will turned to kiss her, his lips gentle against hers. "You are the gift that keeps on giving, Florence Foster. Every day with you is a blessing." As they finally went inside to their bed, Florence felt profound contentment. She had lived a good life, a full life, a life rich in love and meaning. She had faced challenges and overcome them. She had raised children to be good people. She had loved a good man and been loved in return. What more could anyone ask for? The years rolled on, bringing with them the joys and sorrows inherent in a life well lived. More grandchildren were born, and then great-grandchildren. Will and Florence grew older, their hair silvering completely, their steps growing slower, but their love never diminishing. They remained partners in every sense, supporting each other through the inevitable losses that come with age, friends who passed away, their own failing health, the realization that their time was growing shorter. But they also experienced the joys, watching their family grow and prosper, seeing their grandchildren graduate and marry and have children of their own, knowing that the ranch they had built would continue for generations, celebrating milestone anniversaries with children and grandchildren gathered around them. On their 40th anniversary, they returned to the meadow where Will had first kissed Florence, where he had proposed, where so many important moments of their courtship had taken place. They moved more slowly now, and the ride up was harder than it used to be, but they were determined to return to this special place. They sat by the spring, now in their 60s, and looked out over the valley they knew so well. The view was unchanged. The mountains still towered in the distance, the aspens still turned gold in autumn, the wild flowers still bloomed in the meadow. But they had changed, had been shaped and worn and refined by 4 decades of living and loving together. "I have loved you for 40 years, Will said, taking Florence's hand in both of his. 40 years of waking up beside you, of working alongside you, of building a life with you, and I love you now more than ever. You are still the most beautiful woman I have ever seen, and you still make my heart race when you walk into a room." Florence touched his weathered face, tracing the lines that time and sun and laughter had etched there. "And I have loved you just as long. You are still the kind, honorable man who helped a stranger in need. You are still the partner who treats me as an equal. You are still the love of my life, Will Foster, and you always will be." They kissed there in the meadow, 2 people who had spent 40 years learning how to love each other well, and Florence felt the same spark, the same connection, the same rightness she had felt at their first kiss decades ago. True love, she had learned, did not fade with time. It transformed, deepened, became something richer and more profound than the initial passion, though that passion could still flare bright when least expected. As they rode back down to the ranch, Florence thought about the journey that had brought her here. She had left Boston as a young woman seeking adventure and a new life. She had been rejected and humiliated. She had accepted help from a kind stranger. And from those humble beginnings had grown a love story for the ages, a marriage that had lasted 40 years and showed no signs of weakening, a family that would carry on their legacy of love and hard work and integrity. That evening, surrounded by their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, Florence and Will celebrated their anniversary with joy and laughter, and the deep satisfaction of a life well lived. As Florence looked around at the faces of her family, she saw reflections of herself and Will in their features, their mannerisms, their values. They had created not just a family but a tradition, a way of being in the world that emphasized love, loyalty, hard work, and kindness. "Tell us the story again, Grandma," one of the great-grandchildren asked. "Tell us about how you and Grandpa met." So Florence told the story one more time, about the train platform and the rejection and the kind cowboy who had appeared just when she needed him most. She told it with humor and honesty, not shying away from the pain of that initial rejection, but emphasizing how it had led to something far better than she could have imagined. And that, my darlings, is why I always say that sometimes the worst moments of our lives are actually the best, because they push us toward where we are meant to be. If Robert Henderson had not been a coward, I never would have met your grandfather. I never would have built this life. I never would have had your parents and all of you. So his rejection was actually the greatest gift, though he never meant it as such. Then he made room for Grandpa, the child said, repeating the phrase she had heard many times. "Yes," Florence agreed, smiling at Will across the crowded room. "He made room for your grandfather, for this family, for this love that has sustained us for 40 years and will continue long after we are gone." As the party continued around them, Will came to sit beside Florence, taking her hand as he had done countless times over their 4 decades together. They sat in comfortable silence, watching their family, listening to the laughter and conversation, feeling the deep contentment of two people who had lived and loved well. "We did it," Will said quietly. "We built something that will last." "We did," Florence agreed. "Together, we built a legacy of love." They remained at the ranch for the rest of their lives, gradually handing over more responsibility to Thomas and his family, but never fully retiring from the life they had built together. Will passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 73, with Florence holding his hand, their children surrounding them. His last words were of love for Florence, and his last breath was taken in the house he had built for her all those years ago. Florence grieved deeply, but with the comfort of knowing they had loved each other completely for 45 years, that they had built a life of meaning and purpose together, that his legacy would continue through their children and grandchildren, and the many lives they had touched. She lived for another 5 years, remaining on the ranch, surrounded by her family, still cooking and teaching and loving until the day she passed away peacefully in her garden at the age of 75, watching the mountains she had come to love so deeply. At her funeral, their children told the story of how Will and Florence had met, about the rejection that had led to the greatest love story any of them had ever witnessed. They spoke of their parents' partnership, their unwavering commitment to each other, their generosity to community and family, the legacy of love they had created. Thomas held up the locket Florence had worn every day for 45 years, the one Will had given her that first year of their marriage. Inside were their 2 photographs, young and smiling, full of hope for the future they would build together. "This is who they were," Thomas said. Two people who found each other when they both needed it most, who chose to love each other every day for the rest of their lives, who built something beautiful from what started as heartbreak. Their love transformed everyone it touched, and it will continue to transform us for generations to come. Florence and Will were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the ranch they had built together, with a view of the mountains and the valley and the meadow where they had first confessed their love. The headstone was simple, bearing their names and dates, and beneath it, he made room for their love to grow. The ranch continued under Thomas's management, and then under his children, carrying forward the values and traditions that Florence and Will had established. The story of how they met was passed down through generations, becoming a family legend, a reminder that sometimes the worst moments of our lives lead to the best outcomes, that rejection can open doors to acceptance, that one person's cowardice can make room for another's courage and love. And in the small town of Montrose, Colorado, where Florence had once stood on a train platform heartbroken and alone, people still told the story of the Boston woman and the Texas cowboy who had built one of the great love stories of the American West, proving that true love could be found in the most unexpected places, if only you were brave enough to accept help and open enough to see possibility in disaster. Their legacy lived on not just in the ranch they built or the children they raised, but in the example they set of what love could be when it was based on mutual respect, daily choice, hard work, and unwavering commitment. They had shown that happily ever after was not a fairy tale but something that could be built, day by day, year by year, through the good times and the bad, if both people were willing to do the work and to love each other well. And it all started with a rejection, a train platform, and a kind cowboy who saw a woman in need and decided to help, never knowing that in doing so, he was finding the love of his life and beginning a story that would be told for generations to come.